One of these. Turn on now or wait until so I've started recording already. Okay, we might make a start. It's a couple of minutes past, but hopefully everyone who's coming is already here. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Megan Evans, who's a senior lecturer within the School of Business at the University of New South Wales in Canberra here. She holds a DECRA fellowship and her expertise sits broadly within environmental policy, governance and economics, with a particular interest in the use of market-based instruments for biodiversity conservation and climate change mitigation and adaptation. She's got a diverse background, including undergraduate degrees in mathematics and ecology, a PhD in environmental policy and direct experience with policymaking. So I'll hand it over to Megan.
Thank you, Vicky. Hope everyone can hear me okay. Yes, excellent. Thank you. I acknowledge that we're here on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country today. So I just want to acknowledge traditional owners of this land and honour their elders past and present, and also recognise that sovereignty was never ceded and we still don't have a treaty with First Nations peoples of Australia. So thank you so much for the invitation. I think it's maybe the third time lucky. I think I was invited initially a couple of years ago and I was like, I don't know, first year of DECRA and just couldn't cope. Last year, I think I was sick, and here I have run out of excuses. So sorry, that sounds really bad. It's as if I'm like being dragged here. That's absolutely not the case. It's real lovely to come and speak with you, and hopefully Some of what I say might be of relevance to some of the work that you're doing here. I'd love to know a bit more about what you're all doing. So if there's any chance to catch up at some point after or any questions, please do so. So my work for the last couple of years particular has been looking at this so-called biodiversity finance gap and this idea that we need to fill it with private investment. And I'm particularly interested in, that's a lovely idea. How is it working on the ground, or how could it work on the ground? Who are the people and organisations involved? What do they all need to do? Do they know what they need to do? How can we actually operationalise these apparent capital that wants to flow into conservation? I'm just gonna click. So some of you might have come across this latest jargon in biodiversity space called nature positive. And what it is exactly broadly could be, easily understood. Here it's defined as enhancing resilience of the planet to halt and reverse nature loss. But I'm particularly interested in who is pushing this message and why. And the fact that it's the World Economic Forum, which is, global cheerleader of neoliberal capitalism, talking about nature positive, that's pretty interesting to me. And in some of the interviews that I've been doing this year, the fact that it's the World Economic Forum talking about nature is actually what is prompting some corporations and financial institutions to act. When I hear that, as someone with an ecology background, I kind of think, my God, really? It's taken World Economic for them to say something to take attention. Okay, cool. I'm hearing, nature's the new thing that we're hearing about. I'm like, really? We've been talking about this for decades. Nevertheless, it seems to be a bit of a buzzword and a thing that is, if anyone's got on LinkedIn lately, don't. I have to for research reasons these days, because it's just bananas in terms of talking about biodiversity impacts, business, nature positive, etc. And nature's been kind of a buzzword in the finance and business space for particularly the last couple of years. And it's partly been prompted by a report that came out in 2020. It's an annual report the World Economic Forum brings out, where they, using some kind of probably highly unscientific method, they rank various global threats to the world economy. And in 2020, they kind of freaked out because they found that biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse was ranked as one of the top 5 threats facing humanity in the next 10 years. And previous 3 years it had jumped up really significantly. So they brought out their report, which they called Nature Risk Rising, why it matters. And that kind of coincided with the Dasgupta review. So the UK Treasury Commission, Sir Partha Dasgupta, who's a really big economist man, to do like a Stern review for biodiversity essentially, and that also has been a big driver apparently. Now this report, as I mentioned, comes out every year, and now they're ranking biodiversity loss as number 3. So it's getting bigger and bigger in this community, this economic community thinking about nature. So in terms of what is biodiversity finance, that's another, I guess, term that is relatively new. If you search the academic literature for the term biodiversity finance, you won't find an awful lot. If you search for payments to ecosystem services, biodiversity offsets, carbon offsets, agri-environment schemes, that kind of thing, you'll find heaps. Biodiversity finance is just really a catch-all term for all of those kind of schemes. And unlike under the UNFCCC, where by climate finance has a particular definition under that international framework, there isn't a similar kind of definition of biodiversity finance under the Convention of Biological Diversity. There might be one after the COP later this year. But a couple of years ago, the OECD had a crack and broadly defined biodiversity finance as any kind of financial flows whereby improving the state of biodiversity is a primary objective, secondary objective, or a co-benefit. Public and private sources and the use of various financial instruments. So basically any kind of money going to conservation. The word co-benefit is also quite important because co-benefit is often referred to as something that comes as an extra to carbon offset programs. So any kind of nature-based solution that is a carbon offset that might involve some trees could loosely be defined as biodiversity finance, depending on how stringent or how critical you might be. Another narrative that's really been very prominent and increasing in prominence, well, I haven't got data to prove that yet, but you know, you don't need to look very far to find a news article or something like this, usually in the Financial Review. Again, a lot of biodiversity nature stuff in the AFR at the moment, saying that private money is critical to saving Australia's environment. And this came off the back of the State of the Environment report. I didn't read it, sorry. It's all kind of say the same stuff. I kind of, that's one of my non-evidence-based things that I do. I kind of just go, all right, that's going to make me sad. I'm not gonna read it. But one of the things that came out was that we need more private money to help save Australia's environment. I do have another slide that I moved after this one that will link back to this, but you might have also seen some of this narrative in some of the what Minister Plibersek has been talking about in the last couple of weeks. You know, government can't do it alone. We need individuals and businesses to chip in to save the environment because we can't possibly afford the $2 billion a year that would require, never mind the $10 billion a year that we spend on fossil fuel subsidies. But the fact is we can't do it alone. We need to rely on the private purse to do it. But how do you actually get that private money? And it usually comes with a few catches. One of them is that, well, for private finance to flow, we need investable projects. What does that exactly mean? So here's a Reuters article that came out on back of another one of these reports saying that private investors are wanting to ramp up financing of projects that protect and restore nature, but they're struggling to find enough suitable deals. Researchers said on Wednesday. What they're struggling to find projects to spend on, you know, haven't we got, you know, surely we can't have a shortage of projects to invest in for conservation. I mean, the bit in yellow I find really, really interesting. You know, there is enough capital to address the biodiversity crisis. There is no shortage of funds. There is no shortage of finance. John Tobin, professor at Cornell, ex-Credit Suisse. The bad news is there's just not enough investable products that will help deploy that capital. So investable basically just means they want to make a positive financial return on their investment. They don't want to just fund it, donate it as an act of philanthropy. They want to make money, positive financial return, you know, 8% a year. Think of your super funds. How much do you earn on your super funds a year? 8, 10, 15, 20% financial returns per annum. That is what is needed to deploy that capital. So from this point, I'm seeing a lot of the conservation sector is saying, all right, we got to give them what they want in order to get that capital. But how do you actually do that? That's a real challenge. How do you actually make money out of restoring nature? Just to give you a bit of indication, so there's, you know, I mentioned there's been a lot of reports come out. I've been with my colleagues here, been doing a bit of a literature review. This needs to be updated because we've, you know, it's been a couple of years now since we started that. That exponential curve is probably even higher up. If you broadly search Google and Hang here, who's a PhD student at UNSW, has, got this amazing bot that she's developed that scrapes Google of any particular PDFs that has any kind of reference to biodiversity finance, broadly speaking. We found, around 150 in the last 20 years, but, most of which have been published in the last 2 years, which broadly coincides with the release of that World Economic Forum report and the Descriptor review. So a lot of discussion about what is needed to unlock this private finance. And according to these reports, they're saying that in order to get this private finance to flow, we need investable projects, as we saw in that news article. We need investment at scale, which is a kind of ambiguous way of saying we want to invest hundreds of millions, not tens of thousands at a time. We want to invest, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars at scale, because we're an institutional investor or we're a huge investment manager, and we want to deploy a crap load of money and all at once. And we want assurance that we're going to get X percentage return over this kind of time horizon. And they want standardized metrics so they can, a non-expert can be able to feel assured that they're generating these kinds of environmental outcomes in addition to their financial returns. So that's what investors are saying is needed. The reports are also arguing that, there is still a role for government in this space, unbelievably. If you speak to the government, they might think, oh, we still have to do something. Need supportive policy and regulation. So things that will actually incentivize investment, regulations to do what they're usually meant to do, stop biodiversity loss. And a lot of the time, there's a emphasis on needing public investment in nature to de-risk private investment, which is, again, a kind of flowery way of saying we want the public to bear the risk if anything goes wrong. We want to protect our private capital, which, have a bit of a think about and consider, is that fair? I won't go into that too much. Given that this is a fairly nebulous space, and one of the things that I struggled with at the beginning of this project was that, typically when we do, social research or any kind of research, we think, okay, what are the boundaries of this problem? We might be looking at evaluating a particular government program or a particular agri-environment scheme, factors for success. We can define the kind of boundaries of a study by a particular jurisdiction or a program or policy. Because this biodiversity finance space is just so broad and everything, I didn't want to define it by a particular state or jurisdiction other than Australia, in recognition that this, it's very much a government to governance thing, and there's a lot of actors and organisations emerging in this space that I wouldn't have known about previously before I started the research. So it was, intentionally quite a broad scope. And so I've been working to interview key actors broadly involved in biodiversity finance, which includes carbon farming, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. And I haven't wanted to just talk to finance people. I wanted to talk to all of those actors across this governance space who would be involved somehow in these financial flows. It's not just a simple, you go to the shop and you buy some biodiversity, or you go to this particular company and magic happens. There's a whole, huge network of intermediaries, service providers, lobbyists, various kind of industry bodies who are all somehow involved and all have, different views on what is needed to happen from their perspective. So yeah, I've been working on this with Beck and Susan have been my research assistants, and Kirsty's just started as a postdoc after nearly finishing a PhD in climate finance at the ANU. So these are the kinds of folks that I'm speaking to. because it's a fairly, I mean, a lot of you are from ecology, I presume, you know, it's a fairly small community. You kind of, you know, people always pop up. You know, they're here at this university, then they go to this government, and then they come back here. Similar kind of thing. The risk of identification in this space is quite high. So, you know, I'm can only really be reporting or aggregating findings quite broadly. So I'm not even going to distinguish between, you know, say state and federal government, because the team sizes in these departments are so small that if I said, you know, state government, it would be very easy to kind of say, okay, I'm pretty sure I know who that person is from that quote. So, but this gives you a bit of an idea of the kinds of people I'm speaking to. So, you know, people involved, you know, not quite directly, you know, landholders or consultants working on the ground, but, you know, advocacy organisations, land trusts. In the agriculture and carbon space, you know, you've got carbon service providers, aggregators, you know, those kind of companies who go around and sign up landholders to participate in these schemes. In the finance space, again, that's an area that is new to me. I'm not a finance expert. So part of this has also been a bit of an exploratory, what does that ecosystem look like? You know, and as I'm learning very rapidly, there's a huge amount of diversity within that space. You know, you've got banks, but they've got, you know, lending practices as well as capital market, very different teams, very different needs. Super funds, and the way super funds do their investment strategies are very, very different to impact investors. So what do all those folks need or think? And then, yeah, in the intermediary space, so professional services, I mean, for example, the big four kind of accounting firms are very, very big. I mean, that's not a secret. You can search for Deloitte or McKinsey's or EY, and they've got huge teams looking at natural capital and biodiversity finance these days. Now, I've got the vibe of things so far because I haven't had a chance to analyze my interview data in detail yet. That's partly why I hired Kirsty to help me with that. But I can give you a bit of an indication of some of the common themes that I'm hearing from the interviews. So this cartoon kind of sums it up a little bit. So it's a guy at a boardroom who, and the caption is, what if we try to make the world a better place, but for profit? That's essentially what it means when investors are saying we need investable or viable financial products. Someone I interviewed made the point that it kind of seems that those who are wanting to, or those who have made a lot of their money in the past out of destroying nature are now only wanting to invest in nature if they can also make money out of that. You know, that was a comment from an equity and a fairness kind of perspective, but you know, this is a kind of cynical, I suppose, way of pointing out what does it actually mean when people talk about we need investable products. They want to make money out of it. There's also a bit of this. So when you talk to someone from government, they're like, we need to know what private sector wants. We don't know what they want. So we're doing this in the hope that, you know, it'll work. You go and talk to, you know, someone from finance, and they'll say, we need policy certainty. You know, we want clear market signals. They want clear, you know, regulations that actually signal that biodiversity conservation is a priority. Arguably at the moment, you know, we have had a change in government, but, you know, we had the second decadal review of the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act a couple of years ago. Graham Samuel delivered a phone book amount of recommendations to totally reform that legislation, which was, shown to be totally ineffective at stopping extinctions. The current government has said that they will they've committed to a full response to that review. Note that they've committed to a response, not a full implementation of those recommendations. So there's that. It's but I have found another example speaking to another financial institution saying, look, we want to implement some kind of loan product that's linked to delivering some kind of environmental outcomes or condition of, you might get a discount on your interest rate if you do something good. We want to be able to do that, but we can't do that because there's not enough baseline data in Australia to be able to measure progress. We can do that in this other jurisdiction because there's been public investment in collecting that data. We can deploy those products, in overseas. And I've kind of said, well, could you invest to get that data? Oh, no, we need someone else to do that. Partly as I think they just didn't want to spend the money, and partly because it's a risk thing. They don't want to invest in collecting their own data. They need to have that third-party assurance. We're using this credible, data or verification process, also so that they're not liable if something goes wrong. So there's a general trend of everyone kind of needing something from someone else before they can really take substantive action. Again, very cynical take, but I apologize. That's kind of my permanent state of being. There's also a bit of this and this old wine in new bottles phenomenon. I mentioned biodiversity finance term being relatively new, and one of my PhD students is starting to look at how and why this idea of we need private sector investment, private sector to step up, why this has become a narrative that is essentially just it's a truth. It's a uncontestable fact that we need this to be able to do anything. And where has this come from? And it's interesting how we were looking at, I think it was a Biofin, which is a UNDP thing about promoting biodiversity finance solutions in global South countries, and they had as a report of finance solutions to conservation or environmental protection, and there were things like direct payments, subsidies, regulation, payments for ecosystem services, all of these fairly standard tools of government approaches, but they had been recast as finance solutions, which I found really interesting. And what was the purpose of that repackaging? Who are you trying to convince? Is it finance? Is that just a more salient term? Than scary government, doing things we don't want them to do. I did speak to someone who had a diverse background, currently in a government position, but was saying, why do people keep on talking about finance? A lot of this stuff can be solved without finance. It's not necessarily a financing kind of problem for some of these issues. So, and yeah, that kind of grey literature review that I've been doing is trying to, I guess, look at how these kind of new terms emerge and why. The final theme that I'll mention here is that when I asked my interviewees for examples, can you give me an example of finance flowing into biodiversity conservation? An example of a successful project where money has actually flowed into biodiversity conservation. And pretty much most of the time, the example that was pointed to was carbon farming in Australia. And I don't know how familiar you guys are with, the Emissions Reduction Fund and carbon offsets, but the vast majority of the land-based projects in Australia that are registered and operating as carbon projects that are generating Australian carbon credit units occur in this kind of country, in the Mulgalands in southwest Queensland and northwest New South Wales. So semi-arid, sparse vegetation, not a whole lot of carbon per unit area, certainly compared to, high rainfall areas with proper forests. This is still, well, it's just, I would call that shrubland, not necessarily forest. I guess the point here is that there's a huge amount of area that can be turned into a carbon project. But so here's where most of the projects are occurring. So as I mentioned, in southwest Queensland, New South Wales, these are all registered as human-induced regeneration of permanent even-age native forest projects, also known as HIR projects. There's a few issues going on here with the vegetation emissions reduction fund projects. One is, I suppose, that these are not these occur in communities, and any kind of conservation intervention is inherently social and political. I guess I'll just make the point that there's not universally positive or negative views on within communities about how these projects are occurring and who are the winners or the losers. And I guess I'll just also say that it's not that long ago, within the last few decades, that landholders or leaseholders in, for example, in Queensland, New South Wales, Western Australia, were required as a condition of their lease to improve the land, as in clear vegetation. It's, probably maybe not quite within living memory, but certainly, not too long ago that we were telling farmers that you have to clear. And now we're saying we'll pay you to not. So there's, I guess all sorts of social and cultural and political issues that can emerge in that kind of environment. The other issue that you might have come across is some of this discussion around whether or not these credits that are generated from these projects are representing what they say on the tin. Are we actually getting 1 tonne of carbon abatement per credit issued? And myself and some of my colleagues, so Andrew McIntosh and Don Butler at the ANU and a number of others, are arguing that no, they are not high integrity credits a lot of the time coming from these projects, largely because most of the projects are occurring in semi-arid country, and the model that is calibrated or that is used to estimate carbon sequestration from these projects is simply not calibrated for use in that kind of country. It's calibrated for use in areas that have previously been cleared, and that is 95% of the time not where the projects are occurring. We want them to occur in places that were forest, were cleared, and now are going to become forests as they grow back. These projects are being registered in places that have never been cleared. The argument is that, well, we need to protect semi-arid country as well. You can remove cattle and remove ferals, and you get some good protection there, which is true. Are you actually going to get the carbon sequestration that you say you're going to? We think not. So that's just one element of this discussion. And interestingly, when I was doing my interviews independently, quite a number of people in the kind of finance and professional services space were expressing concerns around, well, if one of the first things that we're doing to become more nature positive or try to meet some of our, climate policies or climate targets is to invest in carbon projects, we're a bit anxious about doing that whilst these integrity issues are still, I guess, under scrutiny. So there's an independent review that Professor Ian Chubb is convening. They'll report back at the end of the year. But in the meantime, last week, we had this announcement from Minister Plibersek about creating a green Wall Street in Australia, where, I think she said that, people would come to Australia. Here we go. This is a way of getting additional private sector and philanthropic investment into nature. And there's a lot of kind of boring detail that, I'd be happy to talk a bit more about in the questions potentially, but the legislation that they are intending to be using to create this green Wall Street was not actually designed for that purpose. It was designed, it was Minister Littleproud's agricultural stewardship scheme that was under the previous government. It was designed to incentivize and reward small scale sequestration, restoration on agricultural land, and to create certificates. So a certificate saying you have implemented these activities on this property. So it's a certification of activities, not outcomes. It's not measuring outcomes in terms of, there'd be the ACU component as well, but in terms of the biodiversity outcomes, it's not actually measuring the biodiversity outcomes at all. It's an indication of activities. That's a very different policy framework than to what the minister and even the Prime Minister has been describing as a biodiversity credits market. A credit is simply a credit of that, the only reason someone would buy a biodiversity credit is if they need to offset an impact somewhere. So our demand for credits, of biodiversity credits, whereby we've generated these particular outcomes of biodiversity, is quite different to a certificate saying we have done these activities. It's an activity-based thing rather than an outcome-based thing. So there's been a 14-day consultation period announced for this as of this Monday. I can't remember. It's due on Friday next week. So if any of you have any interest in this space, it's unfortunately everything happens all at once. But I would strongly encourage you to point out that offsets are very different. Well, offsets by definition cannot lead to nature restoration. They can only at best maintain existing decline. It's a no net loss compared to a counterfactual of business as usual. So offsets can only really maintain business as usual. They can't promote nature restoration, which is a very important detail that is unfortunately lost on many of those advocating for voluntary biodiversity credits. So just to sum up, it seems, I think many of you will know that it seems that in your careers, you just keep on saying the same things over and over again because they always remain relevant. But just some general concluding thoughts. In this space, government still has a huge role to play in biodiversity conservation. There is a bit of a, I think, hope of a bit of a passing the buck to the private sector, but a good portion of biodiversity is not necessarily going to be able to be privatized or be made investable. So there's, market failures that by definition, government can only really fix. They can play a regulatory role as well as a market enabling role. Ideally, you would fix the existing market issues before you try to introduce a new one modeled exactly on the broken one, is just a suggestion. Number two, private sector will work, act in the private interest. So it's really just about asking why, what's their motivation for investing in nature. I did have someone call me recently saying, Megan, our clients are asking about biodiversity credits. What do you know about biodiversity credits? And I was like, what do you mean biodiversity credits? Do you just mean offsets? Why do they want credits? Why would they want to buy credits instead of maybe investing directly in land or ag or carbon or forestry or whatever? And after a while, it became clear, oh, well, they might want to cash them in later. So at the moment, buying nature credits or biodiversity credits is being promoted as, oh, we just want to do the right thing and it's corporate social responsibility. But think about, why would they actually want a property right, a credit? They might want to use them later if it becomes clear that actually these regulations now mean that you have this biodiversity impact. So they're wanting to get ahead of the curve to cash in the credits later. Again, highly cynical, sorry, but just, why would they want a particular type of thing over another? Still lots of past experience with market-based instruments, or what we used to call them, MBIs, that we haven't fixed. Last week, the New South Wales auditor brought out a scathing, not an exaggeration to say it was scathing review of the New South Wales biodiversity credit scheme or biodiversity offset scheme, which is a regulatory market. Oh, it's telling me to hurry up. There's still a lot to learn. We're still finding the same issues in these existing schemes that we haven't solved. And also, just finally, consider those people who are working on the ground and delivering projects, and not just necessarily what financiers or investors or government is saying is needed. So thank you. Questions?
What is biodiversity finance for? What will it do? You kind of touched on it, but to me, this is the basic question. When I read that various people are quoting, we need 700 billion over 5 years to, what are they actually going to spend it on?
Yep.
And that's I just wonder if you can kind of stitch together the carbon issue, because it seems to me that the climate change and carbon issue has always had primacy over biodiversity, because it's easier for people to understand, particularly corporations to understand, and it's easier to do stuff in that space.
Yep.
So I just wonder what you think biodiversity finance is actually for, because having looked at the Disruptor report, which is no better than the TEEB report, which is 10 years earlier.
Yep.
We're actually just like hamsters in a cage in the biodiversity area, it seems to me.
Yeah. So what is biodiversity finance for? Hate responding with a question, but it's kind of, it's in the eye of the beholder, right? And that's, I guess, what I was kind of getting at before about why are you wanting to invest in nature? And what do you mean by nature? How do we define nature versus biodiversity? And I guess I've attended a lot of webinars in the last couple of years. They've been run by various financial institutions and bodies and professional services. One of my PhD students has probably spent half of her PhD watching webinars, just to try to get an idea of what are you guys actually doing? And it's kind of dawned on most of us too slowly that a whole lot. And most of the webinars seem to be, okay, this is what nature is. This is what biodiversity is. This is what natural capital is. We need to value it. We need to do blah, blah, blah. Also, I think of interest is the term carbon offset. If you search some of these reports, particularly from the World Economic Forum, you're not going to find the term carbon credit or carbon offset. What you will find is natural climate solution or nature-based solution. Exact same thing. It's just carbon offset's a bit dirty, so we're going to call it a natural carbon solution. And you're right in that, finance is working up to climate before biodiversity. And I'm hearing over and over and over again that, well, we know what to do with climate now. We can broadly apply that to biodiversity, which is why we've had a task force for climate-related financial disclosures, and now we have a task force for nature-related financial disclosures. It is understood that biodiversity is far more complex. Nature is far more complex than climate. There is still a hope that we can get this universal biodiversity metric that is equivalent to a CO2 equivalent. I don't think it's possible, but that's not going to stop voluntary efforts to come up with something that will someone will buy. I had a colleague who was approached by an international investment bank saying, we want you to help us come up with a biodiversity credit. And my colleague responded saying, can't be done for these reasons, and the investment bank responded saying, well, people will buy it anyway. So why, what is the purpose of biodiversity finance? Again, the term biodiversity finance is so broad, it could mean anything. What is the motivation? Quite frankly, a lot of the time it's to tick a box. It's we have a compliance obligation. We need to become carbon neutral. We need to become nature positive. We need to become more nature positive. It's already become an adjective, not rather than an outcome. I don't think that's a particularly good answer to your question, but hopefully it gives you a bit of an indication of the things that I'm encountering. Exactly.
Other questions?
Financial advisory companies, Deloitte's and so on, have huge teams or large teams working on this.
I mean, when I say huge, there's 5 or something, but
Yeah,
it's
sure.
still more than 0, which is what, yeah.
They, I would have thought, would have been the people who would really have figured out whether there was any prospect of financial return or financial benefit more than anyone else. And it
If
kind of
they've
intrigues
figured
me
it
they're
out,
still
why would
trying.
they tell anyone?
I thought they'd have given up by now.
And yeah, I guess that there's very much the assumption that there is, and I've sat in a roundtable meeting with very, famous in policy world people saying there's going to be a wall of capital coming to invest in nature, and I've said, where's your evidence? And why would they do that? They're not going to do that out of the goodness of their heart. I don't think. And look, I don't want to tar everyone with the same brush. The thing is, I have had someone say to me, not on record, that those who are interested in investing in nature from a philanthropic perspective, or those who have made their money and they now want to invest it, they're just kind of quietly going ahead and doing it. An example would be Kilter Rural, which is an agricultural investment vehicle. They've been around for nearly 20 years. They've just gone ahead and been doing their accounting for nature, reporting on progress, for the last 10 or so years. They've done that before all of this discussion. So yeah, there is a lot of noise and a lot of talk. But yeah, coming back to your question in terms of, whether or not there are clients. Yeah, I mean, there are corporate clients. I mean, see the news, Telstra's partnering with the New South Wales Biodiversity Conservation Trust, also the subject of that audit report, to, generate biodiversity or carbon credits that, plus biodiversity. Why would a corporate want to do that? Well, they need to become carbon neutral, and they're trying to get ahead of the curve with the nature positive discussion as well. So there's money. It's just where can the money go into, under what constraints? If it's philanthropic, cool, whatever. If it's investable, they want financial returns, it needs to be coupled with a commodity. It needs to be coupled with farmland, forestry, or carbon offsets, or a combination thereof.
There was another question up here.
I answered it there, but I was like, none of the companies that you're talking about in that stuff seem actually genuinely interested in it. They just want to put it on their website, put it on the Instagram, because, and then when they find out they can't make a profit, they go, oh, okay. So how do you put money on biodiversity if they're going, well, we can't make a profit and it's not philanthropic? They're just still not genuinely interested, or are they just wanting it for like the greenwashing effect of their own company?
I mean, the greenwashing question is interesting because, you know, I've got some good quotes from my interview data saying, you know, they're terrified of greenwashing, but I wasn't able to kind of, I think I might have pushed it back a little bit further in some of my later interviews saying, what exactly are you terrified about? Are you terrified of doing greenwashing, or are you terrified of getting caught? So yeah, I mean, greenwashing is rife. You know, you can have a look at some of the responses. Oh, there's a chat coming through. Can I? Sorry, I'll ignore that while I'm answering your question. Where was I going with that? What your question was, why would they do it? Why would they invest in nature? I mean, it's this kind of, you know, the Spider-Man meme, right? That they're trying to kind of get ahead of the curve. It's well, we know that we've got climate change regulations now. We know that nature is next. I think that's even the title of the report, Nature is Next. They're wanting to, and you know, trying to do a comprehensive understand, like footprinting of what are this corporation's biodiversity impacts. It's like a, you know, when you do an environmental impact assessment for a particular mine, it's a, yeah, there's the mine. And if it's owned by BHP or Rio or whoever, it's not just, we're talking about that, but we're talking about that entire corporation. How do you actually do a biodiversity footprinting analysis of it, that entire thing across, you know, international borders? You know, you've got different regulatory frameworks. It's a pretty kind of horrendous and kind of daunting exercise to try to do accounting of biodiversity impacts in an environment where a lot of the time there is, you know, there aren't particular regulations in place. Like one of the questions that you hear all the time is, well, we don't know how to measure nature. You don't have that discussion when it's a regulated impact. The regulator says, this is how you're going to measure your impacts, and it's guided by, you know, the legislation. We're only having that discussion about how do we measure nature when in absence of a clear regulatory framework. So that's why it's a bit of, oh, we don't really quite know what we're going to do. We could try this metric, but we don't know if it's credible or not. Okay, we'll just try to invest in some nature for now as a bit of a no regrets option. You know, we're saying that we're starting our journey. I hear that a lot as well. We're starting our journey, and then we're just going to hope that that stuff that we buy now might help fulfill some of our regulatory obligations that we have no idea what they're going to look like in future. So it's like, it is genuinely hard. This task force for nature-related financial disclosures, that's, you know, a thing that's being developed by industry or within industry. A lot of companies are waiting to see what that looks like before they start doing stuff, but there is a bit of wheel spinning. Yeah. And as I was saying earlier, you know, what they might be saying is, we're trying to be more responsible, we're doing it out of the goodness of our heart now, might later turn into a, oh yay, we can use that as an offset, because quite frankly, that's what governments do as well. You know, oh, here's a protected area. Oh, we're going to use this as an offset later. Like, look at Watson. That's an offset now. Anyway. Can I respond to the Zoom person?
Yeah.
Wouldn't the money be in auditing of environmentally positive business activities rather than the business? That's an interesting question. I don't know if Sal meant it this way, but I think it speaks to a bit of a point whereby flipping the ticket as a term, this hasn't one that I've encountered much previously, but say how do we make money out of this? And say that you've got a landholder, whether it's, you know, whoever kind of landholder is doing some tree planting, whatever, and they figure out how much it's going to cost, and they figure out we need to be able to sell these Australian carbon credit units, ACCUs, $15 a tonne for it to be worth our time. They sell that to a carbon service provider for 15 or 10, let's say. That service provider says, all right, cool, we're going to sell these to a financial institution or someone else for $20 a tonne. And then that financial institution or advisory firm or investment manager, they go, okay, well, I'm going to sell that same one to someone else for 25. That clipping the ticket thing, whereby everyone makes a little bit of money. The actual action on the ground has occurred. They're not making any more money out of that kind of stream of transactions. So there are a lot of intermediaries in this space who are likely to make a lot of money, whether or not and are. Look at that map earlier with the projects in the desert. Whether or not that money will go back to the actual activities is questionable at best.
Thanks, Megan. I'll try and get my question right here. As someone who's worked in ASX and TSX listed companies, we obviously have a lot of ESG type metrics that we try to achieve. And I wonder, is the community ready? We always talk about the companies, but are the communities ready to go, I'm going to look at these ESG metrics and go, that company's a leader and I want to support that company? Or is it also the community just really interested in profit?
When you say the community, do you mean us?
Shareholders.
Like
shareholders. That could be anyone here who has a superannuation fund. They're investing in these companies.
Yeah.
Do they know which companies they're investing in? Do they really care where they sit on their ESG? So I guess I'm concerned that we put all the onus on companies.
Yep.
But as individuals, as communities, as stakeholders, do we actually really care?
I mean, that's maybe slightly more existential than what I can answer. But through this process, I've learned a lot about how that all works. As I said, I don't have a finance background, but I do have a super account, you know. And I've learned that, you know, and one thing that interviewees were saying, particularly in the super funds and the financial fund managers, were kind of saying, well, the regulations around super, you know, that APRA, Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority, put down or set out are in a lot of their views just not compatible with investing in nature, because superannuation is there to generate, you know, pension for us in retirement. There are regulations that stipulate they must generate this percentage returns per annum over this time frame. That there's not much wiggle room, because and you know, there's very tightly controlled regulations about if you don't meet your benchmarks, as in your performance benchmarks, your financial returns benchmarks, you get a letter, or then you get knocked off. You know, you have to dissolve as a super fund essentially. So those kinds of, you know, short and long term X percentage returns, it just doesn't quite fit natural systems. And they're listed companies. So it's CommBank, it's you know, Woolworths. So if actually Care Super, I haven't interviewed them, but if you go to they've actually got a really useful website, and probably a bunch of your super funds. If you go there and say, you know, they've got their sustainable fund, and if you click the link, it shows who they're investing in. Number one is BHP, because they show up best on the ESG metrics that they use. And, you know, it's kind of counterintuitive, but it's, well, they've been regulated for a really long time. They've had to deal with their environmental impacts for a long time. They're actually pretty good at it, like overall, probably better than Woolworths, probably better than other companies who haven't had to deal with state or federal environmental legislation. But the other thing is that ESG metrics, that there's no standardization. It's, you know, you choose the best ESG metrics that make you look the best. And most of them have, there's really no link to biodiversity. in any of those metrics. And it's also, you know, for a listed company, it's, you know, for a Woolworths or whoever, it's not about what are the, you know, how are they investing in, you know, nature? It's how well are they dealing with impacts? And then it's, you know, some super funds exclude any kind of companies that directly invest in palm oil or deforestation or beef, but that's just direct, not indirect. So they might still invest in a Woolworths, even if they might source, you know, some palm oil or whatever. So it's, I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's very, very complex and opaque to your average punter. So, you know, I don't begrudge anyone who doesn't have time to or fully understand it. I go to the shop and I look at something vaguely green. I'm like, excellent. I won't look too closely because I need something today. So yeah, yes, the community, I think, cares, but I think the system is also prohibitively complex for your average person or even your non-average person to really understand how to engage with it, which is where financial regulations come in. And some of my interviewees were, you know, that point about the benchmarks, you know, the APRAs and the ASICs need to get up to speed with this biodiversity and nature risk conversation as well.
Okay, I think we're out of time now. So would everyone join me in thanking Megan for an amazing talk?